Well guys, I got my trusty screwdriver because it is time for part 2 of my 2019 How to Build a Computer video series, and I'm going all out for this one. If you missed part 1, I talk about sort of theory about building a computer, what all the parts are and what they do, and how to best choose parts that will meet your budget and your needs for building a computer. Now, today, I actually have 2 systems, but even kind of 3 systems I'm going to be putting together to show you the differences between an Intel build and an AMD build, a mini ATX build, and a full-size ATX build, as well as 3 different price points. About a $500 entry-level build, about a $900 upgrade to that build, and then a high-end $1,500 system over here on my right.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com/paulshardware for 10% off your first order, or hang around to the end of the video to find out more. So the parts for these builds were all picked out in my monthly build series, which I do typically at the beginning of every month. So the February builds, I actually did 3. And again, we're looking at an AMD entry-level build you can get for about $480, or you can swap out for the 2600 and a graphics card. I've chosen the GeForce RTX 2060 right here. That brings the price up to about $900. You could go with a less expensive graphics card to shave some money off of that, but of course all that's covered in the first video where I talk about picking your parts and saving money here or spending more money there. On my right side we have all the parts for an Intel based system. I went with the 8700K for this build because you get 6 cores with hyper-threading, so 12 threads total. It's a really good processor for gaming, and it's a little bit more expensive, but you get more performance along with it. So this system over here is going to cost you about $1,500. Let me quickly go over the parts for both systems. So starting with our sub $500 build, and I want to point out that the cases that I'm using today were both picked out by Joe. He just went to Micro Center and picked them out because I wanted some organic, like normal cases. So Masterbox Lite 5 is what we're using for this. You can usually get this for about $60 to $65. Joe got the RGB one because that's what they had there, but you can save $5 by going with the non-RGB version. For a $500 budget, I'd recommend spending about $100 on the case and the power supply. So about $60 for the case, and then you're going to look for a 550 watt, 80 plus bronze rated power supply for about $40, which I have linked in the video's description. I'm using a stand-in for today, so apologies for that. This is a V650 from Cooler Master, which actually isn't really available anymore. But just like the 550 watt Corsair unit I have linked in the description, this is at least modular. This one's fully modular, but that one's partially modular, and it's got all black cables. Another stand-in for today is our SSD. I'm just recommending a 500 gig class SSD, which you should be able to find for about $50 or $55. Again, I have a good one linked in the description. For today's build, I'm using the SanDisk SSD. SanDisk makes solid SSDs, so if you can find one of theirs, go for it. For both systems, I have a 16 gig memory kit. That's 2 8 gig sticks, and I'm going for DDR4 3000 or 3200 speed. Go for faster memory if you can find it, but don't spend too much more. 3000, 3200 is where you get the most bang for your buck. The Stripjaws 5 kit is DDR4 3200 and specifically plays nicely with Ryzen. That's why I picked it out. So definitely make sure if you're choosing Ryzen memory that it is compatible and will work with Ryzen at its rated speed. $115 you can get this kit for right now. The kit I'm using for the Intel build is a little bit fancier, but it's roughly the same when it comes to specs. Still 16 gigs, still 3200 speed, but this kit costs $15 more right now. It's $130, and that's because it's got fancy RGB lighting, which is completely optional, completely aesthetic, and completely up to you whether you want to go for it or not. But I've got both of them, so I can show you guys both options. For our CPU, we have the AMD Ryzen 3 2200G. This is a CPU with graphics integrated, so it's got all of that in the chip, so you don't need a graphics card with this build. This will be perfectly adequate for 1080 gaming. It will have some limitations when it comes to graphics capabilities, but for less than $100, a quad-core CPU and graphics gets you up and running, and this entire system can be upgraded to a $900 system, which I'll show you in just a second. Before that, though, our motherboard is the MSI B450 Tomahawk, about $110, $115 for this board. B450 chipset still allows overclocking, and it's got solid power delivery, so if you upgrade to a higher end processor, you can still overclock it, even the 8 cores on this platform. So if you go with these 6 components, you can get in for less than $500, but you can also, of course, upgrade. So if you swap in the Ryzen 5 2600, you now have a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, but no graphics integrated. This is about $165, so that's going to add about $70, $75 to the price. And then, of course, you're going to need a graphics card since we no longer have integrated Vega graphics in this CPU. So I am recommending the RTX 2060 right now. You can get it for about $350, and this is the MSI Gaming Z Twin Frozr 7 version of that. But by swapping out just those two components, you're going to raise the overall price of this system to around $900, but you're going to get insanely more performance, both with the extra cores and threads on the CPU, as well as a huge jump up going from the APU to a discrete graphics card with the RTX 2060. And now for our Intel build, and this one was actually designed around a $1,500 price, because every month in my monthly builds video I ask you guys for feedback, and everyone wanted to see a $1,500 build, so this is what I would spend $1,500 on if I was going for a higher end gaming PC with an Intel processor. The processor I've chosen is the i7-8700K, which is a 6-core, 12-thread processor. Intel did some kind of weird stuff with their current generation of 9000 series CPUs. The 9700K is an 8-core processor, but it does not have hyperthreading. So you actually get more threads with this CPU, but it costs about $30 or $40 less. It is also unlocked for overclocking, but all of the K series CPUs from Intel that are unlocked for overclocking do not come with a CPU cooler, so we're going to need the Master Liquid ML240R RGB for cooling. This is about a $100 all-in-one liquid cooler, and I'm not going to go into comparing and contrasting different all-in-one liquid coolers, but $100 is a pretty reasonable price for a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler, and I know this one is a good performer. Going back to the Ryzen system, if you're wondering how these CPUs would be cooled, they actually come with heatsink fans in the box, known as the Wraith Stealth and the Wraith Spire. These are not the best air coolers by any stretch, but considering that they come essentially free in the box, you can go ahead and use them and they will work for you just fine. And then maybe in the future you can consider upgrading. Now, one thing I want to point out is if you're spending, say, $100 or $200 on a CPU, don't spend $100 on an all-in-one liquid cooler. Spend like $30 or $40 on something like an aftermarket air cooler like the Hyper 212 Black. You'd be using your money much more effectively upgrading this Ryzen 5 2600 to, say, a Ryzen 7 2700 or 2700X versus going with a fancy all-in-one liquid cooler. But I digress, as Jay likes to say. Let's move on. Our motherboard for the Intel build is the ROG Strix Z390-i Gaming. This motherboard is going to cost you close to $200. It comes with fancier features, but most importantly, it's mini ITX, so it's going to fit in our case and give us a nice, tiny, more compact build since we are putting this system in the NZXT H200i. This is a mini ITX case, but it's still slightly on the larger side, so it's still a vertical tower with a basement at the bottom for your power supply. Still supports full-size power supplies, so we're just going to be dropping in an EVGA 650 GQ here, which is a 650-watt, 80-plus gold-rated power supply with partially modular cables on the back, as well as all-black cabling. For memory, we have the aforementioned Team T-Force Nighthawk RGB kit, which is a little bit fancier and blingier with its RGB. Then I have a couple choices here for an SSD. I wanted a single NVMe M.2 drive like this one, and you can actually get this type of SSD for around $70 to $80 for a 500 gig class drive at this point, which is a really good deal, but I was trying to come in under the $1,500 price, so I opted to drop this one in here just because I was looking at 500 gig SATA SSDs that are 2.5-inch drives like this one, as well as SATA rather than that M.2 interface. And I found you could get a T-Force Delta RGB one like this for about $55 or $60, which is about 20 or 30 bucks savings over something like this drive. And lastly, for a graphics card, I have this RTX 2080 here, which you can get for $700 if you go for an aftermarket version, but that would make this build cost about $1,700 total. I actually meant to use a $500 RTX 2070, but fortunately for the purposes of this tutorial, they both install in exactly the same way. So those are the parts I'm working with today. I'm primarily going to be using a Phillips head screwdriver to assemble everything, but I'll point out to you guys if I use anything else. Let's get started with the tutorial. We're going to start off with some glorious motherboard unboxings, but my workspace here is open, it's non-conductive, I'm working on a wood surface, and if you want to be extra safe, then maybe consider something like a mouse mat or something rubber, something soft that you can work with the components on so you don't damage anything. I currently have out the motherboards for both builds, and I've also got the memory and the CPUs, and then for my fancy build here, I've also got my M.2 SSD. For accessories, apart from the motherboard, there's going to be a bunch of other stuff in the box, like this is a Wi-Fi antenna. We can set most of this stuff aside and worry about it later. You might want to grab a SATA cable if you have a SATA SSD that you need to plug in. So now I've got both boards out just so I can show you what I would pull out if I'm doing a build for the first time. The motherboard manual for each one, of course, SATA cables if you need them. We actually don't for this build, so I've just got one for our AMD build over here. I did pull out these very small screws that we're going to be using to mount our little M.2 NVMe drive. And then the motherboard I/O shield is something you'll definitely want to get out so you don't forget to install it. That goes over the motherboard's inputs and outputs over on this side like that. But a fancy new thing that some motherboards are doing, and this is, I guess, one of the benefits you get for paying more for a motherboard, is that the Asus board here has a fixed I/O shield, which actually is very convenient. I like that. This Ryzen 5 2600 is actually brand new, so I'm going to use this to show you guys kind of a brand new unboxing and installation experience. Inside we've got the CPU itself, and we have the Wraith cooler that it ships with. And an important thing to note with the cooler, the stock heatsink fan that it comes with, is that it will have pre-applied thermal paste right there. So you don't want to touch that or mess with it at all until you're ready to install it. And you certainly don't want to add any more than what's already there because you've got plenty. This is a Wraith Stealth, so I'm going to set that aside. Now here I also want to point out that physically the 2200G and the 2600 look exactly the same, and they have the exact same number of pins on the bottom. When it comes to installation, there's no difference between the two of these. Just make sure if you've got the right CPU. It should be labeled on the top. There are some slight differences if you're looking at an Intel processor versus an AMD processor. The main will be that there are flat contacts or LGA on the bottom of the Intel versus pins that are on the bottom of the AMD CPU. Pins are very delicate. You should definitely be careful not to bend them or break them, and also try not to touch any of the gold contacts on either of the CPUs. Thankfully though, one thing that's universal is the triangle. There's a gold triangle on the corner of both of those CPUs, and you're going to use that to determine the orientation to install into the respective socket on your motherboard. Let's do the Ryzen CPU first. If you look where the gold triangle is on the corner of the CPU, there's also a triangle etched into one corner of the CPU socket. We're going to gently lift up our little retention arm, which will open up the socket, line up that triangle with the proper triangle in the socket itself, and then the processor should just drop down into the socket. This is a ZIF or zero insertion force socket, so you shouldn't have to press down on it at all. If it's not dropping in, then lift it up and try to reseat it, or double check that you don't have any bent pins on the bottom of your processor. Once it's dropped in though, all you gotta do is lower that little arm and you're set. For our Intel CPU, the pins are on the socket itself, so those are very delicate, and that's why there's a plastic cover over the top of it. We're going to take our retention arm here, again push it out to the side and lift it up, and that will open the socket up. You could pop this cover off right now, but I do want to point out that the triangle is actually on the edge of that cover. If you pop it off, there's a little triangle on the edge of the retention bracket as well. But I recommend just leaving it on. Reference which corner that little triangle's on. Take your CPU, line it up with the socket. There's a couple notches on either side of the CPU as well that will line up with notches in the socket. Drop it straight down. I give it just the slightest little jiggle to make sure it's seated in there, and then we can lower the top, make sure it's under the little nut right there, lower the retention arm, and as you push that down, which requires a little bit of pressure but not too much, the plastic cover should pop off, and now your CPU is installed. It's a good idea to get your motherboard set up as much as possible before you install it. In your case, there's a few things that I can also do besides the CPU installation here. Memory I can install in both of these. For my smaller system here, since I have one of these little M.2 SSDs, I can install that there as well. And then I'm also going to be thinking about my cooling solution. So I will be installing my cooler onto this one here. Since this smaller system is using an all-in-one liquid cooler, I'll definitely want to get the back plate installed on that. So let's start out with this little SSD though. This is an M.2 SSD. M.2 refers to the connector here at the end, and it is a 2280 SSD, which means it's 22 millimeters wide and 80 millimeters long. There's actually some shorter and longer SSDs that also conform to this form factor. And then your motherboard may or may not have a heatsink for your little M.2 drive. Heatsink's not necessary, it can run without it, but if you've got it, you might as well go ahead and use it. On this motherboard, there's two little screws that hold the heatsink on, and then under the heatsink, there's a thermal pad with a protective piece of plastic on it. We'll get back to that. You want to fish around in your motherboard accessories and find these two tiny little screws. One is a nut and one is an actual screw. The nut we're going to put on the longer of the 2 points here on the actual M.2 mounting area. And I'm just going to hand tighten this on there, but you could tighten it down with a socket if you wanted to, or if you had one available. I also want to point out here that this is a small motherboard, and so that's a little bit more cramped to work with there. But I got that on. Also, I have another screwdriver. It's still Phillips head, but it's a smaller one to handle these tiny little screws. We can now install the SSD. There's a notch here that'll line up with the notch in the M.2 slot, and if you're concerned about having this label on here, most of the M.2 NVMe drives that I've worked with, the labels are actually thermally conductive, so you can still leave that on. But just slot the SSD in at an angle, lower it down, and then secure it with your tiny little screw. Next, I'm removing the protective plastic from the heatsink, putting the heatsink back on top there, and then securing it back down with the two screws that hold it in place. Don't forget that too. Next up is memory installation, so I'm just going to take my two DIMM slots here, open up the one side here. Some DIMM slots have little latches on both sides, some do not have them on one side. That's totally fine, both ways work. With the memory, there's a notch that's slightly off center on the edge connector there at the bottom, so you just want to make sure that's lined up with the notch in the DIMM slot on the motherboard. Lower it down and then just give firm pressure from the top, both sides. It gives a really satisfying click into place, and the little latch on the side will also close up, and you'll know that it is secure. Also get both of them installed there, and then you can kind of reality check that they're both the same level. That means they're both installed properly. Moving back to the AMD system, we have 4 DIMM slots and 2 sticks of memory. So which slot should we install them to? The short answer, the easy answer, is probably going to be every other slot, and the slots that are further from the CPU, usually to start with. If you want to double check or reality check, bust out your motherboard manual to make sure that those are the right slots. Usually it'll say populate these slots first and then these slots next. Beyond that, installation is just the same as it was on our Intel board. Line up that notch on the bottom, put the stick into the slot, firm pressure down on top of it, and it will click into place. Now let's talk about CPU coolers, because there's a bunch of different mounting methods for those depending on whether you're using AMD or Intel and whether you're using the stock heatsink fan or not. Now AMD's mounting solution for these stock heatsink fans I actually like, because AMD motherboards, at least AM4 socket motherboards, come with this metal back plates on the back of the motherboard, and then on the top it's got a couple little plastic notches. There are some coolers that use these notches, but for AMD's Wraith series of coolers, all you have to do is remove this top piece. And again, I'm cheating with a new tool. Still a Phillips head screwdriver, it's just motorized this time. So I've just pulled those off, and I would recommend saving these, just put them in a Ziploc and keep them in your motherboard box, because if you do upgrade your cooler in the future, there's a chance it will need these. Bear in mind, with that removed, your backplate will now stay put, so you do want to keep that in mind. But all we're going to do is take our Wraith Stealth cooler. By the way, this is the Wraith Stealth that the 2600 comes with. We're just going to line up those 4 screws with the 4 screws on the Wraith and lower it down. When you're installing any CPU cooler, you should keep this method in mind, which is that you want to get the corners threaded. So there I just got all 4 corners threaded, but just barely so. You don't want to cinch down one corner before you have the others going, is the basic idea. And then from there we can go and just give a couple twists on opposite corners, and we'll slowly tighten the whole thing down so that we get good contact between the base of this heatsink fan and the CPU itself. And then that thermal paste squishes in between to fill in any gaps, make sure we have good thermal conductivity. Once that's tightened down, it's actually sturdy enough that you can hold the entire motherboard up by it, so keep that in mind. It might be convenient while you're installing. And then you want to make sure that you go ahead and plug in your CPU fan. You should have a single, probably a 4-pin plug for your CPU fan that comes with. And then your motherboard should have a 4-pin header that is labeled CPU fan that's somewhere close in relation to the CPU socket, and just plug that in there. For our Intel build, I am busting out the closed loop cooler that we're going to use, the Master Liquid ML240R RGB, because it's very helpful to get this backplate set up. Now our Intel board does not come with a backplate. That's standard for the mainstream Intel stuff, but our CPU cooler does for better contacts. Now CPU coolers, aftermarket ones, install in a whole variety of different ways, so I highly recommend if you get one, reference the manual for it for the proper installation procedures. But the backplates has some adjustments back here that you can line up for the different sockets. Once you have that, it pushes through like that, and then this one at least has these little plastic caps that I can fit over the top. That'll kind of hold it in place so it won't fall off as I do the actual installation. With this installed, I can kind of leave it for now, move ahead with the rest of the builds, and then when I come back to actually installing the closed loop cooler thing on here, it'll be ready to go with those mounting points. If you purchased a locked Intel CPU or not one of the unlocked K SKUs that are capable of overclocking, it will ship with a stock heatsink fan that will look somewhat similar to this. These do not require a backplate on the back of the motherboard, they just mount from the top. They also have thermal paste pre-installed just like this, and this just uses a plug system. So the arrows on top are actually to unlock, so you want to actually turn those against the direction they're pointing, and then you can position it over the top and then push down on opposite corners on each one of those to get it installed. And now here's how you unbox a computer case. First, you'll want to slit the tape across the top flaps. Next, we open said flaps, and then we flip the whole thing upside down. Key point to separate the noobs from the experienced PC builders, these little hand flaps down here, pull them out, then lift off the box. Warning, you're about to get a static shock. I recommend using your elbow. And finally, we can remove the styrofoam, put that back in the box, as well as the plastic, and get our first look at our brand new case. You gotta do it like this. Maybe not just like that. Same procedure for the Mini ITX case. Here are our 2 cases, and even though this case is significantly more expensive than this case, it is smaller. Mini ITX, full-size ATX, also commonly called a ATX mid-tower, and they have the same layout, which I'm kind of happy with because it's a pretty standard layout. Front intake at the front for both of them. There is a power supply area at the bottom, and then exhaust at the top and the back. I find with most cases, if you've never worked with it before, it's a good idea just to spend a little bit of time with it. Take it apart, take the side panels off, figure out how things work, and especially if you've got tempered glass side panel windows like this or acrylic ones, leave this plastic sheeting on it while you work with it. That way you won't have to worry about fingerprints or scratches, and then you can peel it off when you've got the build all finished. For most cases, side panels are held on with a couple thumb screws in the back. Sometimes they're captive thumb screws, so they stay with it and make it easier or harder to lose them, which we always appreciate. And then in most cases, you get a small box of accessories and other things to help you work with the case. Screws are often in here, so here's a good time to grab a metal tray like this one, or if you don't have that, just a cup or something, so that as you're taking screws off, you can put them all in a location where you won't lose them. And also at this point is a good time to start sort of reality checking where things are, where they're going to go, where cables need to be routed in particular, and where your fans are located. This case from Cooler Master actually comes with 4 fans, which is pretty nice. It's got 3 intakes in the front. Those are 120 millimeter, and it's got 1 exhaust here at the back. That's a perfectly good configuration to go with, so we're going to leave those fans as is. And then just kind of look at where stuff's going to go. The motherboard sits at the back on the motherboard tray. Motherboard trays very often have this big cutout, and that's so you can get at the back of the motherboard if you need to install one of those back plates I was talking about earlier. While we're back here, you'll notice a bunch of these little knockouts. These are for cable tie downs, so as you're routing cables back here, you can cinch them down and get them as tidy as possible. Power supply mount is down here at the bottom, and that does have a little basement area, so it's kind of covered, so if your power supply doesn't look very pretty, it'll still look okay. And then as far as actually plugging stuff into the computer, once it's all put together, that'll all be back here for the most part. Your motherboard I/O panel will go right here once it's installed, and then these expansion slots down here at the bottom are for stuff like graphics cards or other cards you can add on there like audio cards or capture cards. But the way I like to do things is get the motherboard set up like we've already done, then get the case out and take a look at it. Then we're going to install our power supply in the case. Power supply in the case I feel like are very closely tied together. Then we can install the motherboard. At that point I'll show you where everything actually plugs in. On the back of the power supply is where your power plug is for your AC power cable that plugs into the wall, so that wants to face back. And then power supplies will pretty much always have a fan. You usually want to point that down because most cases down here where the power supply goes are going to have an intake area right there, and they might even have a bit of a dust filter. This is a budget case, so it doesn't have a very good dust filter, but it's still better than nothing. And also in this case at least, and other cases too, if I pointed it up, it's really blocked right there. So you don't want to obstruct the intake of this fan right there. If it's open inside the case, it's okay to have the fan pointing up. Just as a general rule, I tend to face it down. Oh, also, this power supply mounts from the back. So this bracket removes with a couple thumb screws. You actually attach it here with the regular power supply screws and then put the whole thing in. I also want to point out, I'm going to talk about plugging in cables in just a second, but I've already pre-plugged in the modular plugs to this power supply that I know I'm going to need. That will almost always include the 24-pin cable as well as supplemental CPU power, which is going to be either a 4-pin or an 8-pin plug. If you're not sure about that though, just jump ahead a little bit and I'll talk about which plugs you will need depending on what hardware you're installing. Fortunately for our Intel build, the power supply installation is pretty much exactly the same. We have a fan, we want to point that down. We've got this, it's going to point backwards. There's a bracket pre-installed on this case. That's for SFX power supplies, which are smaller, but since we have a full-size one, we're just going to remove that and install it there. And again, I've already got the plugs plugged into the power supply that I want, which is 24-pin for the motherboard power, 8-pin or 4+4-pin for the motherboard supplemental CPU power. I've got some SATA power plugs here, and that is so I can plug in the SSD. This case has a little hub right here which can control fans as well as LEDs, and it has an extra plug that comes down here, so that's going to need some SATA power. And then finally the graphics card has PCI Express graphics power. These are usually labeled as VGA or PCI Express graphics. This one needs an 8-pin and a 6-pin, so I've got both of those set aside. And you should be very careful not to confuse these 8-pin supplemental graphics power connectors, which are going to be a 6-pin block plus a 2-pin block that's optional, with the supplemental CPU power connector, because that's also 8-pin, but this separates into 2 blocks of 4. So at this point, I'm ready to install everything else in the case, but the big questions are going to be what plugs into what, because plugging things in is what most of the rest of the build is about. And since everything plugs into the motherboard, I thought I'd give a once-over of all the plugs on the motherboard and what is required to plug into them for this project. First, power from the power supply. That's going to plug in at the top right here. We have an 8-pin. Sometimes you'll see a 4-pin here. Sometimes you'll even see an 8 plus other supplemental connectors. Usually all you need is that main 8-pin connector plug in, unless you're doing crazy high-end overclocking. Also, the 24-pin 4-pin connector, which is down here along the edge of the board. Beyond that, you might find RGB LED headers. More on those in just a second. System fan headers are very important. They're usually labeled like System Fan 3 or Pump Fan. These are often just suggestions as far as what you plug into what, but they'll usually be labeled in the system UEFI or BIOS as to what is what. More on that in the third video, but generally any fan you can plug in as long as it's a 3 or 4-pin standard fan header. These are SATA ports. You'll notice they're kind of L-shaped and kind of narrower. These will be for plugging in SSDs, hard drives like 3.5-inch mechanical hard drives. You can also plug in optical drives to these, but usually you'll find 4 or maybe 6 on a motherboard like this. There's 2 more here. And then finally along the bottom edge of the board you have a bunch of smaller pinouts. These can be a little annoying to plug in, but they're all necessary to some degree. This right here is a USB 3.0 header, so USB 3 will require that. These are USB 2.0 headers. We will not be needing these today since our case doesn't have USB 2.0 on the front panel. Sometimes you can plug other devices into this though, like RGB control boxes and all-in-one liquid cooler pumps. Right here you have front panel connectors. They're labeled JFP1 on this motherboard, but this is something you want to double check your motherboard manual about. They often put a tiny little chart above it pointing out to which connectors are which. We're going to get back to this in just a second. It's a pain in the butt, but necessary if you want your power and reset buttons to work. Finally, COM header, you can ignore. Another RGB header, which more on that in just a second. Audio front panel header is right there, so if you want your front panel mic and headphone jack to work, you'll need to plug in your HD audio connector to that. Although honestly, front panel mic and headphone jacks are usually not that great quality, but it's there if you have it. And here's the same kind of once-over real quick with the Mini ITX board. So 24-pin power and 8-pin power from the power supply go there. 3 fan headers here across the top. These are RGB headers. On the right is a 3-pin one. That's a 5-volt addressable header. On the left is a 4-pin one. That is a 12-volt non-addressable header. I actually think that RGB LED headers are some of the worst connectors on a motherboard simply because you can accidentally plug into the wrong one. Just keep in mind they're not compatible. Know whether you have addressable or non-addressable RGB LEDs, and don't try to daisy chain these together, or especially don't try to plug in your 4-pin header into the 3-pin out, which you can do. It's harder to plug the 3-pin into the 4-pin. They do have SATA ports on here. 2 are right here and 2 are over there on the other side of the memory. And then we've got front panel USB once again. So that is the USB 3.0 there on the left. This right here is the newest USB 3.1 Gen 2 connector. So if you have a fancy new case that has that on it, you probably want to get a fancy newer motherboard that has that connector on it as well. We won't be using this one today because the H200i does not have that connector, but wanted to point out that it's there. We have a single full-length PCI Express by 16 slot right there. That is where your graphics card is going to plug in. And then that means everything else on this board when it comes to front panel headers, USB, and HD audio is all right in there in that little spot. So again, that is going to be a real pain to get to, but we'll suffer through it. And now for motherboard installation. We have 4 mounting points for a Mini ITX motherboard like this one on each corner pretty much. And we have standoffs that are pre-installed in the case. Standoffs are absolutely required for any computer being installed onto a motherboard tray like this. Since they're pre-installed, we don't need to worry about them, but definitely double check that they're there. And then we can just go ahead and drop this in. I would normally install the IO shield first, but it is pre-installed on this motherboard, so we can just sort of angle it into place, line it up with those standoffs. Then you want to go into your accessory box, fish out some screws, double check that the screws will thread into the standoffs properly. I have already done that. And then we can screw the motherboard in. And the rule of thumb here for these motherboard standoffs is that you want the screws to be snug, but not too tight. Now our AMD build here is a little bit more traditional. We only have 1 or 2 standoffs pre-installed, so we're going to need to make sure we figure out where the other ones go. Fortunately, this motherboard is a very standard ATX motherboard, so there are 9 standoff point locations. 1, 2, and 3 across the top, 4, 5, and 6 here in the middle, 7, 8, and 9 across the bottom. We just need to make sure that all 9 of those points, which will label on the case with an A for standard ATX, the M is for micro ATX. And then a couple suggestions for these standoffs themselves. One is that you'll often get a little standoff tightening nut. Definitely use this. Don't be afraid to tighten these standoffs down pretty good into the case. Don't over tighten and strip them, but you can tighten them pretty good. You don't want them to back off if you ever have to uninstall your motherboard. The other thing is to make sure which standoff screws you want to use, so you'll find those in your case accessory box, and just go ahead and thread those in and make sure that they actually fit properly before you go ahead and install those. I've got all 9 standoffs installed. Gotta make sure to install the IO shields. Make sure this is oriented vertically. Usually the sound IO is at the bottom. Going to install that in this little knockout right here. If you have any difficulty getting the corners of this to pop in, feel free to use the butt end of a screwdriver to kind of pop it in place. And do be careful, these can sometimes cut you. Now for the motherboard installation, pay attention to your rear I/O because that needs to pop through that I/O shield that was just installed. So you kind of angle that in. Now the two standoffs that were pre-installed in this case actually have little ridges that pop out on top of them. So once I get it sitting on those, it should kind of stay in place right there. So that just happened. Now it should mostly stay there while I can get my screws and finish securing it to the case. Now we get to plug everything in. I'm going to use this rear fan plugging in right here as sort of an example of a few things. One, fan headers. A lot of fan headers are 3-pin like this one. That's just fine. Even if you have a 4-pin header, you can still plug it in. Just bear in mind there's a little plastic notch on one side that needs to line up with the 3-prong portion. Next up, cable management. Like, you don't want to just leave this hanging there loosely. We'll give you a hard time on our live show if you send in a picture of your computer and you do that. But don't kill yourself over it either. That is an extremely basic job. I just looped the cable around and wrapped some twist tie around it and then sort of wrapped that up to keep it somewhat tidy. If I was doing this and I wanted it to be more presentation worthy, I probably would have looped it around and tried to tuck it in back here and just had the cable come out to plug in there. But I just want to point out, guys, cable management is important. It helps keep clear airflow through the case and also helps keeping things from getting dusty all the time. But it also doesn't need to be an immaculate job with no cables visible anywhere, especially if it's your first time building. And for our AMD build, here are the rest of the cables sticking out the opposite side of the case. So here at the front, there's 3 fans, and they're RGB fans. Since this is the RGB version of this case, there's 3 3-pin fan plugs. So I could just plug these in if I wanted just the fans to spin up and I didn't want the fans to light up. And then there's a separate plug here for the RGB LEDs. So I can actually go ahead and plug this directly into the RGB header on the motherboard. It's a 4-pin 12-volt, by the way, and that way the front fans will light up too. Beyond that, we've got front panel stuff in this group. USB 3.0. These are our standard front panel headers, often the most hated part of a PC build because they're very small, but those are going to go into the front panel header. There's our HD audio. And then for the power supply, power, SATA, PCI Express, and supplemental CPU. Now there's no set order for plugging in all these cables, so I'm just going to start with the front panel ones because I hate those the most, so get it out of the way. I am unplugging this little fan splitter. These are for the 3 front panel fans. It just connected it over to a Molex plug. I would have to plug a Molex plug into my power supply to plug this in, and when you have a Molex plug, just direct connection from your power supply to your fans, they just run at full speed. I want to have fan speed control from my motherboard for these fans, so I'm going to plug these directly into the motherboard itself. So since I'm passing cables from this side of the case through to this side of the case to plug them in, it's good to have like a nice angle on it. So, you know, come at it from the back and you can sort of reach both sides, get a nice kind of reach around action on it. I had a small problem plugging the fans in, which is that these fan cables need to reach up to these 3 headers on the motherboard, and this one just barely doesn't quite reach. So I have the option of getting like a little splitter or a small extension, but that's not included with any of the parts, so I didn't want to add that. So instead, I've just unmounted this fan. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees so that the cables go from being down at the bottom to a little bit higher up, and that should give me enough cable length. For these connectors from the power supply, just bear in mind they all have a clasp on one side, and that should line up with a little ridge or catch on the plug itself. And sometimes you need to kind of wobble these back and forth or work them in, but usually just some firm pressure should get it to snap in place, and you're good to go. Supplemental CPU power is up in the top corner of the motherboard, and there's the smallest little pass-through gap right there for it. So just gonna feed these through. I'm not sure how visible this is going to be, but just wrapping these around, plugging them in the same way as I did the 24-pin. Now the horrible front panel connectors, they're all plugging into this little block right here, and there's a chart for it here, and this should also be reflected in the manual. Bear in mind that the LEDs are labeled with plus and minus, so you might notice the hard drive LED has plus and minus there. The power LED also has plus and minus, and those you need to plug in properly in order for them to work right. The power switch and reset switch, you can plug in either way and it'll work, so don't worry about those. All right, and there's front panel. You'll notice I already plugged in the USB 3 as well. That's just got a notch on one side for orientation, and now our front panels are connected. Actually, the last thing I forgot was our RGB header that's feeding over to the 3 front fans. I wasn't going to dwell too much on RGB for this video, but it is something that can add a lot of complexity to a build, especially if you're doing the addressable stuff. Fortunately, this is simple, 12-volt, 4-pin connector. There's a little arrow on one side. That should line up with the 12-volt, which is the highlighted left pin here. So all you gotta do is plug that in, and now our fans should light up pretty RGB colors. We're almost done with the less expensive version of this build. The SSD I'm going to mount right up here because there's a fun little SSD mount. There are also some drive caddies down here in the bottom of the system where I could mount a 2.5 inch or a 3.5 inch drive, but since I got an SSD and it's black and red and it'll match, go ahead and install it up here. There's just 4 small Phillips head screws at the bottom. Those were also included with the case accessories, and now we can use the single thumb screw to install this up here. I already showed you an M.2 drive installation, but if you're using one of these 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drives, this is a mechanical drive, this is an SSD. They both have 2 plugs on the back or the bottom, however you look at it. Both these plugs on the back have an L shape to them, so they can only be plugged in one way. There's a longer connector on the left that's for power, and there's a shorter connector on the right that is for data. So the left is going to need a plug from your power supply, and the right is going to need a SATA cable that routes from that plug over to your motherboard. I'm afraid I never showed you guys how I got this front panel piece off, but for most cases, it's a standard method, which is just to grab the bottom underneath right here and give it a tug, and it should pop off, and then it just snaps back on, kind of in the same way. But I'm happy to say that build 1 of 3 would be done right now if we were building that sub $500 build. Because if we had installed the 2200G here instead of the 2600, we'd essentially be set to go. Our motherboard's installed, power supply's connected up to everything. We have our SSD installed for our operating system. We could turn it on, we'd use the video outs on the motherboard back here to connect up our monitor, and then we could get the system up and running and start loading Windows or whatever we wanted to do. If we then wanted to give this system a massive upgrade, it would simply be a matter of uninstalling the CPU heatsink fan, which you guys should be familiar with now, removing the 2200G, getting your 2600 or 2600X or 2700 or 2700X for that matter, installing it, reinstalling your cooling solution on it, and then of course adding a graphics card. So that's what we're going to do next. For graphics card, we have a long edge connector right there. That is going to slot into the top PCI Express slot. At the back, we have I/O that's going to line up with the I/O brackets at the back. And then we've got a couple supplemental power connector plugs that we need to plug in as well. So if you line it up right here, you can get an idea of which of the 2 rear brackets you're going to need to remove to provide space for the rear video outs. Then we're going to take our edge connector, line it up with that PCI Express slot, and we will go ahead and push it back. Once it goes in all the way, there should be a bracket here back on the PCIe slot that sort of engages and holds the card in place. Then you can take those screws you just removed and replace them to hold it even more securely. And finally, those PCI Express graphics power cables that I had set aside earlier, just feeding through from the back, and we're going to go ahead and plug in. Again, latch is on the bottom there, so 1, then this is a 6-pin, so the 2-pin here just isn't going to be used, and 2. If your cables are bulging on your cable management side, here's the pro way of reinstalling your side panel. Ta-da! And now we have gone from a $500-ish kind of entry-level gaming, still powerful but good gaming PC for 1080 or so, to like a crazy nice system that you could game and stream on at the same time. This graphics card could easily handle 1440 or even some 4K titles depending on the resolution you're playing at and everything. And you've got a really nice system. So that's what I really like about this platform from AMD, the upgrade path. You can start out with something simple, you can upgrade to something much nicer. So getting back to the Intel build, we essentially have to do the same stuff that we just did with the AMD build. The main difference with this system is that we now have an all-in-one liquid cooler to deal with. And this fortunately isn't that much more complex than what we did with the original build. It's mainly a question of this radiator that we have. We need to position somewhere in the case. This pump and block unit we need to connect up to the CPU so it's got good contact and it's cooling stuff. And we need to make sure that everything's plugged in because we got a couple fans that are going to go on the radiator, and of course we have to make sure that everything's plugged in for the pump side as well. Guys, I'm going to mostly ignore the RGB features of this cooler to focus on the functional parts of it and, practically speaking, installation for right now. So this is going to go in the front of the case about like so. And we are going to have a couple fans connected to it. They're going to be moving air. We need to make sure these are moving air in the right direction. Pretty much all fans, the side that doesn't have a bracket is going to be where the air goes in, and the side that does have the bracket on the back is where the air is going to come out. But the point being is that when this is on the front, we want air to be drawn in through this. So we're going to want those exhaust parts to be pointed back like that. So that's how we're going to mount them. Also, we can think about how we want the cables to go. I want them to be fed towards the back of the case, so I'm going to rotate these around so that those are in a better location to be fed towards the back. Here's another pointer we can make about things you spend a little bit more money on and features that you don't get with lower end cases is a removable radiator bracket. That's actually a pretty useful feature if you're installing an all-in-one liquid cooler. With 4 thumb screws here at the front, I can remove this whole bracket. Now we can mount the radiator to the bracket and then mount the bracket back to the case. Ta-da! I'm feeling like we're in the home stretch here, but again, plugging in cables, and we have pretty much the same array of cables that we had with the larger case, 24 pin. We have some SATA plugs because I do want to plug in this little NZXT hub, supplemental CPU, PCI Express power. We've got a USB 3. We've got a USB 2 because that also goes over to this little hub. We have front panel, which is in a block. Thank you NZXT for making these in a single block so you can just plug them all in at once. And HD audio is also right there. We've also got some fan headers potentially, and then just the single SATA power also for that little NZXT hub, so I might as well plug that in right now. And I decided to do the plugging in before I actually installed a CPU block pump, just to give us a little bit more room to work with inside. I'm also abandoning most of the RGB in this build. I'm just gonna have some basic functional RGB setup because we have like 3 different potential RGB systems. We have NZXTs, we have Cooler Masters, and we've got the ASUS stuff on the motherboard. So there's not a whole lot of room to work with in this case, especially along that top edge, but fortunately I have all the important things plugged in where they're supposed to be plugged in, and now I can move back to the CPU installation. I did route the CPU pump plug up to the pump header up there too to make sure that's plugged in before I install this because it'll be a lot harder to get at once this is installed. There's a separate bracket that I need to install here to line up with the Intel socket, and then I will just mount it to the backplate piece that I installed towards the beginning of this video. But before I do the final installation, I will need to add some thermal paste. This CPU cooler has been used before, so it needs thermal paste between the copper contact plate and the CPU heat spreader itself. If you got an all-in-one liquid cooler, chances are it will come with a small tube of thermal paste, which you can usually get a few uses out of at least. But the basic idea is to put about a pea size, or maybe slightly smaller than a pea, maybe between a grain of rice and a pea-sized blob of thermal paste, right in the dead center of the CPU. I'm now just going to twist the CPU pump block around so I can mount it on the back plate that I set up before, get it fed over those threads, try to get nice even pressure down on that thermal paste that I just installed, and then I will take my little cap screws and start screwing down. Again, here we're going to use the 4 corners method, just get each of the 4 corners threaded on there and then tighten them down a little bit at a time, going in a circuitous sort of fashion. Last thing to install is the graphics card, and this has sort of a 2-tier external retention system for this case just because it's a mini ITX case, so it's smaller. So the mounting hardware is here on the outside, but just gotta remove these first. Little bracket pops off, and then you can get at the screws behind it. And now our last potential conflicts, our front panel connectors, HD audio and everything are kind of covering the PCIe slot, but definitely something that you want to plug in first. I'm going to need to push those over to the side, and they're going to kind of feed through this little gap that's right there between the bracket and the PCIe slot. So guys, I now have 2 computers that I've built today, and hopefully you guys now know how to build these computers too. The fact that they're both spinning up and seemingly working is a very good sign, and of course the next step is going to be installation of Windows and a bunch of other stuff that's all coming in the video part 3. But before we get to that, we now have the fun part. Before I move on though, I'd like to quickly say a thank you to this video's sponsor, Squarespace. If you're not familiar with Squarespace, they help you do the internet better by setting up a website of your very own. You can find the link in this video's description, squarespace.com/paulshardware. If you click that, you get 10% off of your first order. I use Squarespace to power my merch store at paulshardware.net, and it's just really easy to use and get set up because they have templates that allow you to set up a web page that looks nice and looks professional, and they make sure it will look good on any device you happen to view it on, whether it is a smartphone, a tablet, or a desktop PC. So check out Squarespace if you want to make a responsive, flexible website for your business or for a hobby or just to establish yourself as a paragon of internet proficiency. They also have commerce functions that allow you to integrate a store like I've already done with paulshardware.net so you can sell your sweet merch. And if you ever need help, they have 24/7 support via live chat and email. So once again, Check out squarespace.com if you need to set up a website, and check out the link in the description if you want to get 10% off of your first order, or just go to squarespace.com/paulshardware. And thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So I think this is the first time that I've built two systems in a single tutorial video, and that caused me to get confused. And in fact, you probably already are aware of this, but I've realized that I put the wrong graphics card in the wrong system. This system was supposed to have an RTX 2060, which I put in here. This system was supposed to have an RTX 2070, and I instead installed the RTX 2080 in here. So this system was supposed to be about a $900 build with an RTX 2060 in it, and this system was supposed to be about a $1,500 build with an RTX 2070 in it. Fortunately, when it comes to building the systems, that doesn't really matter. The graphics cards are essentially the same except for the power connectors that plug in. So when it comes to you building your own system, all the instructions you saw today were accurate. I'm just probably going to swap these before I move on to the third video, especially if I'm going to do any testing with these systems. The other thing I might recommend that not everyone does, but you can do if you're worried about getting your whole system built and then finding a defective product, is doing an outside of the box build before you put everything together. I didn't do that today, but I'll post a link in the description to one of my earlier how to build a PC videos where I did do that. It's pretty simple. It's just like assembling the system but without the case, and then you power it on and make sure everything works, and then you're like, okay, good, and then you can go through with the installation. All of my hardware seems to be working properly, so that's good. Knock on wood, of course, and we can move on to stage 3. Stay tuned for that video, of course, and thank you so much for watching this one. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed it, and I'll post links to lots of relevant stuff down in the video description down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. Thank you guys so much again, and we'll see you next time.